Hi, everybody. We're going to wait a couple of minutes to get started because people are still coming in. We'll wait about one more minute to begin. Okay, let's get started. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Katie Harris. I'm from the Seattle MLK Organizing Coalition's Workshop Committee. I'm an older white woman with curly gray hair and black framed glasses sitting in my home office in West Seattle. On behalf of the coalition, I want to welcome you to our 2022 Community Workshop Series, which is taking place all week through Saturday. This year, we're holding 13 virtual workshops on various topics that are related to social and economic justice. For information about the workshops, I'll put a link in the chat. Before we begin today's workshop, I want to mention some housekeeping items. If you would like to access captioning, please look for the CC at the bottom of your Zoom screen. For Q&A, for questions, you can put your questions in the chat and the panel will have a Q&A session after their presentations. I'm sorry, I think I said you can put your Q&A in the chat. You can put your Q&A in Q&A. In terms of the chat, you will not see other people's comments, but all of your messages in the chat will go to the presenters, and they will be able to send messages to you. At the end of the workshop, we'll ask you to complete an evaluation. And we hope that you will do that because it's very important for us in terms of future planning. So now I'm going to introduce you to our panel on Black, Indigenous, and people of color and transportation equity. People of color are often not at the table when major transportation decisions are made for communities. In this workshop, you're going to learn about Seattle's BIPOC groups that are leading transportation work impacting communities of color. Panelists are going to describe their coalition building around climate justice, mobility justice, unjust traffic enforcement, and legislative advocacy to build a transportation future that's rooted in equity. So now I'm going to introduce you to Olivia Smith, who's going to be the moderator for this session.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you. Welcome everybody for joining us today. I'm so excited to share space with you all and have this conversation of the inspiring, amazing work that is being done by these organizations. My name is Olivia Smith. I have a light skin. I'm wearing a gray sweater and a green headscarf. And I am an anti-racist community organizer from Seattle, Washington. I have been part of organizations like the Seattle People's Party and the People's Institute Youth Agenda, and organized around the No New Youth Jail campaign. But I got my start organizing with the Seattle Transit Writers Union, and definitely, excited to hear how the work around transportation has progressed over the last several years. Before we get into the panel, I want to turn it over to one of our panelists, Renaissance, who's going to open the space for us with a land acknowledgement. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Renaissance, and I hope everybody can hear me and my mic is turned on. I'm with 350 Seattle. I'm also with Who Streets Are Streets. And let me see, describe what I look like. I am wearing a ball cap that is a Black Lives Matter hat. I have a prison abolition shirt on that's also Black. It is from Mass Liberation, which is a national organization. And I'm also flossing my MMIW shirt, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, People, and Families, the people that I'm connected to. And I'm a light-skinned individual, and I come with a bit of light-skin privilege. And today, for our land acknowledgement and grounding, I'd like to describe first how I come to be in these lands. Part of my lineage is that I'm descended from enslaved peoples from the African continent that were brought over to the Eastern Seaboard. Best of my research puts that around Florida or Georgia. And at some point before the 1900s, my family mixed with the Cherokee Nation as well on the Black side of my family. And I also have Irish ancestry. They came to these lands on the Eastern Seaboard as well, up in the northern region in the 1830s. And so we're a part of the colonizing engine that became the United States. My father's family, the Irish side, they were all in the Boston area. My mother's parents were from Delaware and Maryland, just north of the Mason-Dixon line. And both of those parents met in, my grandparents met in Seattle. My mother was born in Japan when my grandfather was a mechanic during the Korean War. And I was born in '82 in Salt Lake City, and my family, fleeing from racism and from state repression, settled in Seattle, which is Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Puyallup, Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, and Coast Salish lands. And where I'm pulling this information from is from a resource that has been made available publicly. I have the link underneath of this map that's over to the left of the screen that shows a general rough sketch of where many of the tribes from this region were and are still to this day. And that address is native-land.ca. And we've also been asked, when sharing this story, to also talk about the people and how the lands were taken. And so I've pinpointed the Treaty of Point Elliott, 1855, Governor Isaac Stevens, who manipulated a lot of negotiations with many of the tribal members during that time. And you can do a bit of research on that with the Duwamish tribe. And the link is also embedded in, and we can send that link out later when we send this presentation. It's a complicated history, and another great book to take a look at that you can also pick up from the Duwamish tribe is The River That Made Seattle by B.J. Cummings. It was a beautiful read, it's quick, but it tracks out a really interesting history of how the land shifted and also how the people congregated together. And with that, I think I'd like to pass it back to Olivia. Thank you very much for allowing me to ground us in where we're at today.
Thank you, Renaissance. Thank you for sharing that history. I appreciate it. And it's so important as we start this conversation of how people are moving around our community. So how our panel is going to work today, we have three presenters, Rebecca Rosado, Ethan Campbell, and Renaissance. Each presenter is going to share about their organization and what they've been working on. And after all three presentations, we are going to come back together for a discussion and question and answer. So please, as Katie mentioned earlier, be dropping your questions in the chat or the question and answer box, and we'll be tracking those throughout and bring them all together at the end. So first, I would like to welcome Rebecca Rosado from Front and Centered. She leads the resource and communication development that guides the membership experience at Front and Centered, which is the largest coalition of community of color-led groups in the Pacific Northwest, whose diverse missions and work come together at the intersection of equity, environmental, and climate justice. Rebecca has a background in project management and a history of community engagement. In her role as membership lead, Rebecca coordinates member events, oversees the annual summit, and implements programs to serve the members of Front and Centered and the communities they serve. She looks forward to finding new ways to bring the conversation of just transition to a neighborhood near you. So I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Olivia. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let me know. Are we good?
Yes, perfect.
All right. So hello, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. As Olivia said, I am with Front and Center. I'm so grateful to be here and discuss the work that we're doing in just transition and transportation. The work that we do with our members organization, Front and Center is a coalition. So the work that we do with our member organizations and partners across the state and nationally really allow us to amplify the voice of the BIPOC community. What we do in Front and Center is exactly that. We amplify the voice of the community. We work with organizations. As Olivia said, Front and Center is an environmental justice coalition. It was conceived in 2014 around the idea that climate change movement needed to be embedded in principles of racial justice and economic equality. So we started out small, with less than a dozen organizations here in Washington, and since has grown pretty large, over 70 organizations all across Washington state that include BIPOC-led organizations. All of our members are nonprofits or community groups who are led by people of color. They have people of color on their boards, their staff, and very importantly, they serve the needs of the BIPOC community. And that's the conversation that we're having right now today in transportation. And that is so important, is to amplify the voice and to talk about the needs and how do we serve the BIPOC community. As a coalition, we strive to ensure that the laws made protect the environment, the laws that mean to protect the environment are explicitly done to protect the people. That is a little tongue twister there, but basically we want to protect the people that the laws are affecting. Let's just keep it real, right? All right. So what Front and Center does is we work towards a just transition. We work from an extractive economy. What just transition is it strives to work in a strategic framework that we seek to educate and create ways to shift from an extractive economy to a living economy. So we are right here, and then we want to be right here. So we're living and thriving in resources and purpose, and we're investing in the communities that are affected. Ultimately, the transportation system is very vital to this shift. Transportation pollution is leading cause of global warming in our state and poses significant health problems to those who are often exposed to it. Those people are predominantly people of color due to discriminatory policies of how freeways and major roadways are constructed, as well as racism in zoning and land use codes. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And I know that other presenters are going to talk a little bit about that too. We all kind of fit together. All right, so what do we mean about the transportation system here? So the transportation system is made up of sidewalks, roads, train lines, highways, airports, ports, you name it. It has wheels, we'll call it the transportation system. Vehicles, ferries, we're going to talk about airplanes, buses, passenger ferries. Ultimately, though, all of those things, we can break it down to one simple thing. Ultimately, the transportation system does two things. It moves people or it moves goods. All right, so that transportation system is a little bit unbalanced. Let's say it's a lot unbalanced, right? So we are out of balance. BIPOC communities are disproportionately impacted and underserved. Let's talk about pollution. Black and Latinos experience 56 to 63 more pollution than they create. Whites experience 17% less than they create. Let's talk about costs. Lowest earning 20% spend approximately 30% on transportation. Accidents, we are at a 25-year high for pedestrian deaths. Native Americans, Native people, they are 6 times more at risk. Accidents, transit facing unprecedented cuts due to COVID-19 and chronic underfunding. Mobility, low-income people walk and bike the most, yet have the fewest safe options. And police brutality, traffic stops is how most Americans interact with police. So where's the balance? All right, more numbers. You didn't know I was going to take you to math class, did you? All right, so 25% of us are non-drivers. 25% are non-drivers. All right. That means that 25% of the state's population are non-drivers, yet 4% of the state's transportation budget goes for transit, bike, and pedestrian investments. Let's talk about greenhouse gases. 45% of the vehicles create greenhouse gases. Let's talk about the heat dome. Everybody remember that really hot summer? I mean, everybody was stuck in their house. It was hot. We didn't have air conditioning because what? It's Washington. So in June, a heat wave that scientists say that would not have been possible without climate change killed more than 1,200 people in Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia. To borrow a phrase from Heather McGhee's Some of Us, it hurt Black, brown, and poor people first and the worst, in whose neighborhood the highest temperatures were recorded. Everybody paid a price of that heat dome. 1 out of 8 females in Washington have asthma. These are just numbers that are real and that affect our community. And again, I already said this before, but I'm going to say it again. 56 to 63% Black and Latinos breathe much more pollution than they create. That's real. That's something definitely to think about. And then greater than 95% of our funding, excuse me, as I clear my throat here, greater than 95% of our transportation investments go to cars and investments into our highways. We could be taking some of those funds to invest in alternatives, invest in what we already have to make a safe environment for Black and brown communities, to make it an equitable, what we're talking about today, an equitable transition, to a just transition to equitable transportation. So let's look at a little picture. We're going to pause with all that math. We're going to throw all that away, right? We're going to think about that a little bit later. Let's look at this picture. In this picture, you see a bus stop. In this picture, you see a bus stop that is not accessible to people with disabilities, which it's on a busy road. Our investments, instead of going to the roadways, can go to creating a safe and a walkway for people to get to this bus stop. If you see the people in Yakima, this picture was taken in Yakima, they did come together. They did talk about this and they did try to bring attention to this. So the solution was to move the bus stop. And you see in this picture, you see where the older sign position was. It's still not accessible to roadways. It's still not accessible to people with disabilities. It's still not a safe place for someone to stand. Let's say you have a family to stand and wait for the bus. So let's talk about how we are investing. Let's start thinking about and shifting from how we are investing those funds and how we are investing the money to create a safe and equitable space for people to ride the bus. I'm going to go ahead. Let's look at this picture. This picture is a father walking his kids to school. This happens often in Black and Brown communities. This is not a safe space to walk to school, to get to school. This is many routes in Black and Brown communities and BIPOC communities take place in areas just like this. We're taking away from what is already there, the funding that is already there, and putting it into investing in our communities. So this way we can create a safe space for our children to walk to school. Let's talk about what we have been doing. Front and Center has, again, we amplify the voice of the community through our memberships, through listening sessions. And last year we held a lot of listening sessions and a lot of fun events. In those listening sessions, a reoccurring theme is, what do we want? What do we want out of equitable transportation? How do we create that? And what we got was, we wanted better transit, cleaner air, and safer streets. One of the other events that we held was a viewing. We partnered with organizations, we have 350 Seattle, Seattle Neighborhood Greenways, and we hosted a film screening for Ramps Nowhere by Minda Martin. That is actually part of the workshops this week, which is so exciting. If you have the opportunity to view that and listen to the panel that came afterwards. Again, it's another opportunity for the community to interact, not only with the director, but with the people who fought in 1950s to stop a major highway, to stop a major network of freeways. In 1950, transportation planners here in Seattle were intent on building the densest network of freeways in the world. I'm just going to pause for a minute. That's big. So the plan would have displaced thousands of especially people of color and low-income people. Over the next decades, Seattle Black Panthers, broad-based coalition of communities, they all came together and they were known as Seattle Freeway Revolt. They created a movement. They managed to halt construction of 2 major highways, downsize another, and saved homes, shorelines, businesses, and parks. We honor that struggle that they did in the past. We're going to talk about it later in another workshop. And we continue that today, because what they did is they came together to, again, amplify their voices, and they worked together to organize, to create a change. And that's something that we hope to collaborate with all of you here today, and then spread that to our membership and beyond, to collaborate to create the change. So this way your voices can be heard. Another thing that we did was we partnered with Yakima, excuse me. We partnered with Yakima Asian Pacific Islander Coalition, Disability Rights Washington, and 350 Washington to work to develop a transportation bill of rights. The Transportation Bill of Rights have just the basics and the needs of the people. And all of this came from not only those listening sessions where people came together to tell their stories, but also organizations who work in the communities, the frontline communities. And these are things that we are taking to the legislature. The session just started. We are taking to different communities. We are gathering stories and creating things like this. So this way, all of those things that you guys are working on and telling us, we are taking that straight to Olympia and beyond. And Another thing we did was create a bill. We're working right now with representatives to draft a piece of legislation to bar highway expansion from communities that rank 9 or above in the Washington State Health Disparities Map. This would stop new highways from being built or expanded in communities that have faced the burden of pollution. This bill is very similar to one that is sponsored in Seattle, and there's also one that is started in Oregon. The health disparities map that I am referring to, this is the health disparities map. It is a tool that I encourage everyone to check out. You can find it on our website. And what that does is it talks about the disparities between race and location here in Washington State. It's a really interesting tool, and you can find it on our website. The second bill that we created talks about, excuse me, I apologize. I have a bug in my throat here. Second bill that we created talks about developing a frequent accessible transit standard for our state. What that does, can you still see my screen, Olivia? Okay. All right, so what it does is today, only a few communities have reliable and frequent transit. It doesn't have to be this way. We know it doesn't have to be this way. So what we want to set a target of 50% of the population that can walk or roll in 10 minutes to transit that runs every 15 minutes, 16 hours a day. And within that bill, we also are designating 1/4 mile of accessible sidewalks around each stop. So what we saw in the picture earlier in the presentation doesn't have to happen. With this bill, that won't happen, and it will stop and be built. So thank you so much for listening to me cough and talk about what we are doing. I get very excited about it. I can go on, but I am definitely aware of people's time. One thing that I do want to say is go to frontandcenter.org. We have a landing page. I know that 350 Seattle Renaissance, 350 Seattle also has information on there. We partner with Disability Rights in Washington. They have information on there too. You can learn, you can watch videos. The most thing that I want to say is we invite you to talk about your experience. Email me, call me up, let me know what you're experiencing and what your ideas are. That is our main focus. That's what we do, and that's what we want to share. That's what we want to shine. We want your voice to shine bright. So thank you. Thank you for letting me take this time, and I'm going to pass it back to Olivia.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rebecca. Yes, powerful work. As you were talking about the statewide work, it reminded me of just last week during the snowstorms, and the mountain passes were closed. And after the crews worked to open them, the state transportation was saying they're open, but first priority is the freight and the goods and the commerce, and then the people come afterwards. So I thought of that with the scale and balancing how can we better meet the needs of people. So thank you. And if you have questions for Rebecca, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll get to them at the end of the session as well. But next, I would like to welcome Ethan Campbell. Ethan is a safe streets and bicycling advocate with Central Seattle Greenways, a local group of the Seattle Neighborhood Greenways Coalition. Over the past year, he has been co-leading and contributing research for the Helmet Law Working Group, a coalition including Cascade Bike Club, Real Change, and members of other transportation and equity-focused groups formed to address the inequitable enforcement of King County's bicycle helmet law by race and housing status. Outside of this volunteer work, he is a PhD candidate in the School of Oceanography at the University of Washington. Awesome. So I'll turn it over to you, Ethan. Ethan, thanks.
Thank you, Olivia. Let me sit up here. So how does this look? Okay, great. I have to give a shout out to Rebecca. That was an incredible presentation, and I think a great grounding for all the discussions that we're going to have today, which I look forward to. I'm Ethan Campbell, as Olivia introduced me. I'm here representing Central Seattle Greenways and the Helmut Law Working Group. My pronouns are he, him, and to provide a visual description, I'm a mixed race, light-skinned Chinese American and white man in my 20s. I'm wearing a dark gray colored button-down shirt. I'll be speaking today about one very small piece of this broad spectrum of the many issues that exist around transportation equity and people of color in Seattle. And that topic is traffic stops in Seattle. We're mostly talking about traffic stops of bicyclists, which is the issue that I've been researching over the past year and a half for the Helmut Law Working Group. And I should say, I hope you'll forgive me in starting first with a very research-heavy discussion to introduce this topic before I go and introduce our working groups organizing and how we came to be after that. You can find more technical details about what I'm going to share in the 2 reports that are linked at the bottom of the slide, and you can expect to get a copy of these slides along with all of ours by email following this workshop. Okay. So in America, as Rebecca introduced, traffic stops are the most common way that people come into contact with police. Every year, there are tens of thousands of traffic stops in Seattle, mostly of drivers, but also of pedestrians and bicyclists. And to borrow from the words of this workshop series namesake, we know that the likelihood of being stopped by police is shaped in large part by the color of your skin, rather than the content of your character or other factors. And I'm going to start by introducing traffic stops of drivers. And in Seattle, we know that drivers who are Black are ticketed at a rate 3 times higher than their share of the Seattle population, or actually 4 times higher for stops that have some investigative component. And this is from a report by Seattle's Police Monitor that found that an individual's race alone helps to predict the likelihood of being stopped, as well as frisked, even after accounting for disparities in crime, other demographics, socioeconomic factors, and neighborhood and geographic trends. And yet, minority subjects in these stops were less likely to be found with a weapon. It's important to realize that most of these stops are not at the moment serving a critical safety purpose. According to SDOT, the top 4 contributing factors to deadly collisions in Seattle are speeding, inattention and distraction, DUI, and failing to yield to pedestrians. And those violations together represent much less than half of all tickets that are issued. Instead, most stops are for minor violations, like an expired registration sticker, a broken taillight, or failing to signal a lane change. The same goes for people walking and rolling, who can be cited for jaywalking. And let's be honest, we all jaywalk, because it's often a rational choice when we're faced with poor street infrastructure, like too few crosswalks. But in Seattle, we know that jaywalking tickets are issued to Black pedestrians at over 4 times the rate of white pedestrians. And reporting from around the country has actually shown that police use these violations to detain people they find suspicious, to search them, and to check for warrants. Lastly, there's biking. And most of my presentation is going to be devoted to this. So I'll just summarize that in Seattle, Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous cyclists receive the brunt of enforcement compared to white cyclists, which, given these other statistics, I think should not come as a surprise. So let's talk about police stops of bicyclists. I want to emphasize here that the issues I'm highlighting are by no means unique to Seattle. We know that racial disparities in bike enforcement are prevalent across the country, whether you're looking at Chicago or Dallas, Oakland, Tampa, New York, LA, New Orleans, or Washington, DC. And in all of those areas, reporting has shown that Black and Hispanic riders are stopped at higher rates for minor violations. In many cases, police have recorded that a significant fraction of those stops are motivated by some form of suspicion, however vague, of criminal activity. And in practice, that can mean maybe someone matched some loose description of a suspect. Maybe the officer thought that they looked poor but were riding a nice bike, or they simply happened to be riding in a neighborhood that has a high crime rate. all of those could be grounds for a stop under suspicion. And for those reasons, it's been argued that police stops of cyclists represent a silent barrier to bicycling in some communities of color. But it's not just those racial disparities that we should be concerned about. It's also the fact that every one of these stops creates the opportunity for something to go wrong. There hasn't been as much reporting on outcomes of bike stops compared to other traffic stops, but we know that in LA County, at least, 16 police shootings have taken place during bike stops, and 11 of those were fatal. All of those were suffered by Black or Hispanic cyclists. The thing is, as with other traffic stops, bike stops can be tense. Officers often go into them expecting confrontation. So bike stops have the potential to be dangerous for everyone involved, but really particularly the person being stopped. That's kind of heavy. I want to just break down some statistics now. The various reasons that people have been ticketed on bikes in Seattle. So this pie chart shows that the majority, 55% of tickets have been issued for violations of our County Board of Health's helmet law, followed by 31% for traffic violations like rolling through a stop sign. And then that's followed by lights violations at 7%, and a bunch of categories that are less frequent. And to be clear, these are just tickets. For the majority of bike stops, those lead to a warning, not a ticket, and about 85% of those are for helmet violations. But if you're cited for not wearing a helmet, that incurs a significant fine. It's $100, including court fees, or $150 if the ticket doesn't go paid, and if it isn't paid in 19 days. And in my research, I found that over 3/4 of tickets have gone unpaid, indicating that these are predominantly being issued to people of lesser means. Unpaid tickets, in turn, they get sent to collections, and that can impact one's ability to obtain credit, can have other legal consequences. And previously, traffic infractions could actually lead to your driver's license being suspended, including bike infractions. But that practice was put on hold last year after a statewide lawsuit from the ACLU. I want to move on to the question of who gets stopped by police while biking, and I kind of teased this at the start. But this figure at the right is from the Seattle Times, and it summarizes the research that I've done. On the left here are the demographics of bike helmet tickets based on court records, and you can see that 17% of those have gone to Black cyclists. This is being compared on the right to Seattle's biking population, of which Black folks are approximately 5%. And comparing these two bars, you'll notice a really severe disparity, namely that Black cyclists have received citations at a rate over 3 times higher than white cyclists. Additionally, not shown here, but for bike stops that were partially motivated by some suspicion, in other words, a pretextual stop, about 20% of those have been of Black cyclists. That implies a higher disparity of 4.5%. Stops with an explicit investigative purpose called Terry stops, those are even worse. 31% of those have been of Black cyclists, translating to a disparity of 9 times. So also worth mentioning here is in my research, I've found stark disparities for Hispanic and Indigenous cyclists. And there's another dimension that really I think we have to keep front and center here, which is that based on police records, at least 38% of those of bike stops have been of people experiencing homelessness. And I strongly suspect that's a low estimate. This is just what police record. This is really important context to help explain the racial disparities, because we know that in King County, Black and Indigenous people are disproportionately impacted by homelessness. Some might look at this and say, well, the disparities just reflect different rates of helmet use, to which I say that doesn't make it any better, but also that's not correct, because I found that these citation rates actually remain disproportionate even after one tries to account for different rates of cycling and different rates of helmet use across different groups. Lastly, these enforcement practices have had a real impact. We've heard in our advocacy from community members, both people of color and people experiencing homelessness, and people who fall into both categories, who have felt harassed, singled out, frightened, and intimidated while being stopped by police for helmet violations. Having shared the statistics and the human context, I want to make the case that the costs of continuing bike enforcement outweigh the benefits. And there aren't many benefits, because we see that these traffic stops, again, mostly for helmet violations, are just not serving their intended purpose. Over half of them I found are for investigative purposes rather than solely some, well-intentioned safety education. And the frequency of stops is actually so low that they can't be argued to be providing a real deterrent effect in the first place. And while we know that helmets are valuable, recent studies in the medical literature have found that weakly enforced helmet laws show no relationship with head injury rates on a population-wide basis, which begs the question, why have the law in the first place? And that said, all this said, there are significant costs too. Expensive tickets go unpaid. It can bury people further in debt. For communities of color, disparate treatment erodes trust in the police. And for folks who rely on a bike for transportation, which, as Rebecca introduced, is a large chunk of folks don't drive in the city, enforcement limits their mobility. And of course, as I said, there's the inherent danger of any traffic stop. So with that research context, you're probably wondering, what have advocates like myself actually been doing about this problem? This timeline tries to answer that question. And our work started in July of 2020, when CSG spun off a working group to look for ways to reduce unnecessary contact between police and people of color who bike. And what we landed on was helmet law enforcement, for the reasons that I've shared. A few months later, our coalition grew to include homeless advocates after a video from Real Change and reporting from Crosscut showed that homeless folks have been disproportionately cited. And then in February, our working group successfully pushed the County Board of Health, whose law this is, to review the helmet law and the impacts of enforcement. In May, we wrote a letter arguing for the need to repeal the law. Previously, we hadn't come out in favor of that stance, and 23 local and national groups endorsed that vision. From June to September, the County Board of Health has been discussing the helmet law and the possibility of repeal. Unfortunately, in October, they postponed a vote on repeal after some in the medical community raised some last-minute concerns. But I'd say that our group is confident that the board is going to work through those concerns, and we think that they're on track for voting on either a partial or full repeal of this law next month. It's been a long journey to get to this point. This last slide here, where do we go from here? I want to wrap up by envisioning a system that creates real safety for bicyclists and all road users. By safety, I mean safety both from the very preventable crashes that too often cause injury and death, but also safety from unnecessary policing. First and foremost, I've made the case for getting rid of traffic stops of cyclists entirely, because current enforcement practices are by and large not serving a useful purpose, and the costs are high. Instead, I think we have to invest heavily in a safe systems approach that relies on equitable investment in a safer built environment. And that means more bike lanes, more traffic calm streets across the city. These are the interventions that we know reduce the risk of injuries and fatal collisions. Now, if there's still a need for enforcement after that, that can be done by unarmed individuals. It's not hard to imagine a world in which that takes place. And then we should do the same evaluation and apply the same advocacy for other forms of traffic stops that don't need to be happening. Because focus on bike stops, but so much of what I shared is applicable to these other forms of traffic stops. Speaking of which, the call to action here, there are many folks working on these issues. Renaissance is going to be talking about the BIPOC led Whose Streets Are Streets work group, whose work has been a real inspiration for this, and whose recommendations I've borrowed very heavily from here. And I would encourage people to get involved with WSOS and hear more about that. Additionally, Transportation Choices Coalition has been coordinating a monthly table to work on citywide and statewide strategy around these issues. And if you're interested in getting involved, I'd put contact info here. You can send me or Hester from TCC an email to let us know that you'd like to join. With that, thank you for your time and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Ethan. Thanks so much for sharing. Both your and Rebecca's research and the statistics paint such a clear picture that whether or not the policies, the funding was designed to promote safety, the reality is not bringing safety to everyone. And yes, want to transition into Renaissance's presentation. Renaissance, the poet, among many things, is a hip hop and spoken word artist, as well as an intersectional organizer and activist who has been engaged in the struggle for Black and Brown liberation in the Black Lives Matter movement since 2014. He has also worked with many community members to address gentrification, food sovereignty, land rights and indigenous sovereignty, climate change, US imperialism, draconian immigration policies and practices, inequity in education, unfair labor practices, rape culture, gender oppression, mass incarceration, and much more. For his day job, he now works as a campaign co-director at 350 Seattle. Today, he's representing Whose Streets Are Streets, a BIPOC group dedicated to reviewing and revising laws and policy to better meet the needs and support the lives of all street users, in particular the BIPOC community, who have had historically been excluded from the full and free use of the shared public space. So I'll turn it over to you, Renaissance.
Wow. I don't think I've ever heard that out loud. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who is still with us in this presentation. Thank you, Rebecca and Ethan, for those very illuminating looks at our community and how everything's being impacted. And I'm going to ask a quick question. Does everybody see transportation equity in BIPOC community? My apology to anyone who is watching this webinar right now that has a hard time seeing green. That is the color of Seattle neighborhood greenways. I'm hoping that I did a good job at making sure that the rest of the colors in the presentation meet with what people need in order to be able to read, but I'll do my best to be able to describe. One further disclaimer is that I do apologize that I will be opening up some large topics in this short, brief discussion, and that I doubt that we'll have enough time to fully dive into a robust conversation. However, in lieu of having those robust conversations, we will be sending out copies of the presentations. And in this presentation, I've embedded links and descriptions and definitions of many of the words and ideas that I'll be sharing. So I hope that everybody gets what they need. And I am now dropping my personal email and the Who Streets email into the chat for anybody who would like to reach out for further information if there's not enough time to discuss at the end. Just to recap, in case anybody else has joined in from the first time that I did this, I am a mixed individual. I am of African descent. I am of Cherokee descent. I'm of Irish descent. I'm mixed. I'm light skinned. I'm wearing a black hat. That's a Black Lives Matter hat with white letters, a black shirt. And with that, I'll jump in, and hopefully I'm in time enough for us to have a discussion at the end. So who is Whose Streets? Whose Streets Are Streets? And what are we about? For over a century, the laws in Washington State and in Seattle have been largely written, enforced, and prosecuted by white people. I hope that's not too offensive, but that is the literal sense of what it is that we're describing and why we're prioritizing BIPOC folks. And what we seek to do at Whose Streets Are Streets is to review and recommend changes to street use, design, laws, and policies to better meet the needs and support the lives of all street users, but especially those of us who are BIPOC. And what we're describing here is kind of, one, we're prioritizing those who are most impacted, and by unjust, unfair, and unbalanced systems. I think that the slide that Rebecca shared that had the teeter-totter was a really pristine example of the imbalance in the system, and the description was right in line with what I'm describing now. But part of the theory that we're also talking about is that rising waters raise all ships, or something that I learned from the Combahee River Collective, which is a group of Black feminist authors and activists in the early 70s, that by improving the conditions of those who are least well off among us, that conditions for everyone are also improved. And the link to what they wrote will be embedded in the slide later so that y'all can check out their writing and see how much we are now in our current movement space, drawing from the work of our predecessors. And to work towards these changes, what we're working on doing, very similar to what Front and Centered has done, is to pursue gathering our community members' experiences and vision for what the future can be like, so that we can analyze and review what kind of changes are necessary and we're not making the decisions by ourselves. And the way that we do this is, first we have our values, and second, what we have are a list of questions that we test every policy or law by. And our first value is people first. Place over space. So often the way that the laws are written and how they're employed is that it's property first. And we did a lot of questioning. The image that I'm sharing with this is of a protest that happened in Seattle that directly questioned who had the authority to decide who was going to be in the street. And what we were protesting was police brutality and the murder of Black folks and Indigenous folks here locally and nationally. But the question of, is the place important? Who do the police protect and serve? What do they protect and serve? And what we came to find out really quickly is that they protect and serve property and the interest of property more than they do the general people, in the way that their behavior shows up in what it is that they seek to protect. So we're asking, does this law or policy put people first? Does this law encourage Black, Indigenous, people of color share in the communal ownership of our streets? And we're running it through that test. And the next value that we have is systems change over individual changes. The questions that we ask following that value is, are we responsible for keeping ourselves and our families safe in dangerous conditions, or are civic actions and investments being directed towards creating safe, thriving public streets? And our last value that we hold in high esteem is decriminalizing poverty. And the questions that we ask from this value are, does this law or policy prioritize people with privilege? Does this law or policy seek to limit debt accumulation and the criminalization of poverty? Does it limit or remove criminal and civil penalties for activities and actions that don't harm other people? And I think that there's a couple of really important terms in here, and I've highlighted them in pink. And I have a definition for that embedded into the slide, but to go into it real quick, privilege refers to certain social advantages, benefits, or degrees of prestige and respect that an individual has by virtue of belonging to a certain social identity groups. Normally, and the way that we tend to look at this, especially if we're defining and we're talking about race, is how people were born. Were they born Black? Were they born brown? Were they born white? And that gives a certain level of privilege or oppression, depending on the system and a person's identity. Were they born male? Were they born female? Were they born non-conforming in gender? And then those have different levels, and we can get into that deeper. But as I said, when I began opening up some deep subjects here, and criminalization is a process of classifying individuals as criminals. The insidious part of this practice is that when the laws are codified, they are not as explicit as to say Black gangsters are illegal or trans sex workers are illegal, because many of the laws are now drafted in quote unquote colorblind language. However, the laws have the same impact. For example, when a person who fits the description of either a Black gangster, drug dealer, or trans sex worker, like a young person wearing a bandana or in a hood, they're then targeted and identified, and a handshake can get somebody arrested or incarcerated. We'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm watching the time to make sure that I get through this. I'd like to tell everyone what Who Streets Our Streets is planning on doing for this next year. Who Streets Our Streets is partnering with Seattle Department of Transportation, otherwise known as SDOT, and Vision Zero to conduct a series of listening sessions and discussions and to produce a report of recommendations from Black, Indigenous, and people of color to submit to the Department of Transportation. We will not be working with cops. That is definitively written into our grant contracts. And we have living recommendations that we are continuing to push for and fight for in the community, as Ethan pointed to earlier. And I have those linked in here and you can read them in depth and what they mean. But to name them in brief right now, we're pushing for a cease of involvement of police in traffic enforcement entirely. We're also seeking to reduce traffic violence, prioritizing non-punitive methods for making streets safer. We're also pushing for the recommendation is to abolish enforcement of activities and actions that don't harm other people. And lastly, to invest in people and communities to foster ownership of public places, trust, support, and invest in the owners and experts of individual communities. And as Ethan was talking, a thought came to mind that was brought up to me by a comrade in the movement space, that if we're questioning what safety is, and we're defining what safety is for ourselves and thinking through what a ticket does, wouldn't it be just as simple for an officer or somebody who is talking to somebody that doesn't have a helmet, that instead of writing them a traffic ticket for having a helmet, that they provided them a voucher so that they could get the helmet? Why are we setting up laws in a way to extract from our community as opposed to enhance our community? And I think that gets at a lot of what Rebecca was talking about in thinking about what is a just transition. How are we actually empowering our community to be sustainable and to thrive as opposed to pulling away from ourselves? I don't have all of the time to dive as deeply into everything as I would like. The context of ticketing sits in the context of the prison industrial complex, where, and I love that Rebecca pulled from Movement Generation and showed that graphic in Movement Generation, because Movement Generation does a really wonderful explanation of what is a just transition. They talk about the encapsulation of capital and money and power, and that is only permissible. They can only hold that by having military and paramilitary forces that keep the people docile and from out of power. And it's about unturning that. And so as we're challenging racism, as we're challenging classism, as we're challenging genderism and capitalism, then we're encountered with an image like another one that I'm sharing from another protest that happened down at Westlake, where the police are sent out while we're trying to have discussions with the public and we're trying to have discussions with the elected officials. They're sending hard forces against us. However, what I was told was that if we don't have haters, we're not doing enough. And so the fact that they were there showed that we were getting under their skin and we were doing something right. 10 minutes time. Are we at the limit here?
I just dropped in the chat, but for those attendees who can stay, we can stretch our time to 6:15.
Okay, I'm trying to run quick. Gentrification ended up being a really important part of our talk about what is a just transition. When the light rail was put in through South Seattle and running down into Tacoma, they put on these gangbuster like cop units that were pushing people off of the light rail. And as the light rail went on, one of the reasons that we analyzed and through lots of research figured out that they put these cops on there because the property values in the South End were getting ready to rise. And that meant that some people couldn't afford to live in that area, and that new people were going to come in that could afford to pay the cost of that. And that was going to change the dynamic from one of the most diverse zip codes in the country to being one that was more wealthy and better off. And what they were trying to do was to extradite the process of removal of people by increasing how much police was there. And if we don't have a just transition built into the improvement of our transportation infrastructure, we might see more things like this come to play. The two are not distinct, they are working together. And because I'd like to have some room for talking, I'm going to move through this. What we're looking for at Who Streets Our Streets is 10 candidates to work with very closely over the next year while we're doing all of these listening sessions. And that would be for about 20 hours a month, about $45 an hour, or roughly $800 a month. And what those people will be working on with us is communication, drafting, and having social media output, talking in our meetings, talking about our events. And the email that we would like to share with everyone that's already in the chat and is also embedded in this page is Who Streets Our Streets, WSOS@seattlegreenways.org. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to work with you. And definitely any organizations that you know that have values very similar to ours, we'd love to partner with in all of these listening sessions and comms. And why we think it's important for everybody to be here: public safety defined by politicians and the law is police, jails, prisons, probations, tickets, etc. But public safety defined by the community is peacemaking, transformative justice, reproductive justice, food justice, housing justice, educational equity, and a healthy environment and a just transition for us all. We think about safety in much different ways than is put down upon us. And we should be the ones who are defining what safety is. And that's why we think that it's important that you work with any of us and all of us, and that we all do this together. Bringing this to a close, and this is the last slide so that we can get into the other conversation. I wanted to share with y'all all of the folks who are working with us at Who Streets Our Streets. We have Royal Ali Barnes, we have Claire Cantor, we have Alex Liu, Ian Muse, Yes Segura, Kale Shannon, Evelyn Romano, and, well, Renaissance. And the last thing that I'd like to say in closing is that Martin Luther King Day is a celebration of a symbol of justice. And that symbol of justice is justice for us all. But I would be remiss if I didn't name the other folks who have always inspired me, like Joanne Gibson Robinson, who was the president of the Women's Political Council that organized and planned the Montgomery bus boycott for years before Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King ever showed up, who was brought in as a spokesperson for the movement. Or Bayard Rustin, who had been with the Congress of Racial Equality throughout the 40s and in the 50s, comes into Montgomery to help Reverend Dr. King. And when he walked up to the house that Reverend Dr. King was staying in, he noticed that there were 2 armed guards outside of his house, and he informed Reverend Dr. King about what nonviolence is. It's more than just a strategy, it's a way of life. But we don't often hear about Bayard Rustin because he was a Black, openly homosexual man in the 50s. Or Fannie Lou Hamer, who was an organizer in Freedom Summer, or Medgar Evers, who was an organizer in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or Ella Baker, who was the brain and the initial organizer of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, better known as SNCC, or Bernard Lafayette, who organized with SNCC in Selma for 2 years prior to MLK showing up when Bloody Sunday happened on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Audre Lorde, the Black lesbian mother, warrior, poet, professor, and activist. And rest in peace, Bell Hooks, an author, professor, feminist, and social activist. Angela Davis, who's an organizer and activist with the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, professor, author, and abolitionist, and Assata Shakur, an organizer and activist with the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. And the reason that I like to run down lists like this is 1, it's not all men. 2, we're not all straight. And 3, nobody ever does anything by themselves. The only way that we're going to win liberation for us all is if we all do it together. And that's why we're inviting you in. Thank you so much for my time and for listening to me. And thank you for letting me go over. We really appreciate and love you all.
Amazing. Thank you, Renaissance. I am fired up now. So appreciate having those names spoken into the space and, you know, channeling that history that has gotten us to where we are today. And thank you everybody who's still with us. I know we're over time, but there's been so much to talk about, and want to make space for discussion between the panelists. And let me pull up questions, but yeah, definitely so many intersections when people think, you know, social justice, transportation might not be the first thing that comes to mind, but how we're moving, how we are in public spaces, the opportunities we have access to, all tied to transportation. So I love having this as the center of the workshop. And, you know, with transportation, you know, maybe this is an area that not many people think to engage with. So a question that has come in from the audience is focusing on community engagement. What do you see as key barriers to participation that need to be addressed or removed to empower and enable BIPOC voices to guide transportation planning? And I can drop this in the chat as well, but want to open that up to you all if you see any barriers or any more opportunities for empowering people to guide transportation planning.
So focusing on engagement, it needs to be accessible, just like we're trying to make transportation accessible and trying to bring the message. All of these things need to be related because people are busy. I'm just going to say it. People are busy. People are out there trying to work, take care of their families. They're trying to survive a pandemic. They are busy. And how do we relate this to our community and show our community that transportation not only affects them, but they can be activists. They can in their own way. They can understand the issue, to meet people at their kitchen table, in their street, in their neighborhood. That's the important. I know that that's what we're trying to do at Front and Center, is to make it accessible, show people different ways, collaborate. Renaissance and Ethan both mentioned about collaboration, and all of us, we spoke about each other. This right here is making it accessible, and I think that that's the barrier, is to maybe not a barrier, but it's something that we need to think about, is how to empower them, is how to empower people and make it easy for them, not only to understand it, but to show them that this is happening and you can do it too. You can be an activist right from your kitchen.
I love that. Accessible, it has to meet people where they're at, because we know that the barriers are so many of them, but poor outreach, maybe no outreach, outreach in the wrong language, and it's not just like a lack of outreach, which is literally reaching out, but also a lack of listening when responses are received, or biased listening that fails to recognize that very often most of the input is coming from people who have the most time or energy or resources to give that input. So that, yeah, the outreach has to be local, has to be accessible, has to be responsive. And I think as someone who's a member of a fairly well-resourced, affiliated with a well-resourced, well-connected, long-standing transportation advocacy group, it's groups like ours, like Greenways, and so many others in this space that have to hold transportation planners and city planners to account and hold them responsible when they don't engage in equitable, accessible outreach.
Wow. I think access is the core. And before I name anything else, I'm going to name the fact that I'm an anti-capitalist. And I think one of the barriers that's inside and underneath in trying to get at root causes of what is access is the way that the system is developed, is that a lot of those, many of us who are most impacted by the systems are kept just poor enough that we expect that if we step out of line, that we're not going to be able to have enough to make it through tomorrow, but we might only have enough to make it through tomorrow. And if we can't get our basic needs met, like food, house, shelter, safety, how can we invest any extra time to do something that might not hurt us until next week or next month? So the way the economy is shaping up is something to really focus on. And that comes right back to the graphic that Rebecca shared earlier about how do we get to the kind of economy where we're at. Something else that Movement Generation talked about was a deep democracy. Instead of having somebody 3,000 miles away trying to tell us what we need to be doing in our town here, they identified that all of our decisions should be made on the smallest scale possible. And that would free us all up to make decisions about the transportation in our own lives. And then when we start talking about Nixon and criminalization and disenfranchisement that they used to smash the civil rights movement, when we get into deeper analysis of that, what we have is over 12 million people nationally, and I don't know what the number here is locally, who can't even vote on what our school buses, our buses, or our sidewalks are doing. So being able to actually have a voice in the system is important. But for those of us who haven't had that stripped away from us, or who have fought hard to get it back, like myself, a formerly incarcerated individual, then we have to deal with tokenization, where they grab us, they don't compensate us, they take our work, they take our messaging, like what they did with restorative justice, and they stripped out all of the social and spiritual elements of that, took it away from the Takashi Clinket peoples, smashed it, put it into a book that only reduces it now to a continuation of punitive efforts. And they've removed all of that. Tokenization. If we can pull away from tokenization inside of the system and free up our people. And so what we're doing is grabbing resources so that we can make it available. The last thing that I'll say before I pull off of my soapbox is when they have all of their meetings, when people are supposed to be at school or at work, we can't take off time to show up to their meetings. Again, other elements of access. If they had their meetings as our elected officials or people that we pay with our taxes to have a job, then they can show up at night when we can have that, and they can provide childcare for everybody else so that we can actually participate. I'm not happy with the way that the government's run, if you can't tell, but I see a way through it.
Awesome. Thank you, Renaissance. Yes, see a way through it. And as we get ready to close the workshop, and I'll pass it back to Katie in a second, but want to invite the panelists and the attendees, everyone who's shared this space with us, to think, to yourself, just imagine, vision, what would a world look like with just transportation? When we get through this just transition, what does it look like? What does it sound like, feel like, smell like? Let's, I want everyone to get that into your senses and into your mind so we can move forward with this community engagement, working with each other, coming together. And, we should reach for the stars, and we, have abundance. We have everything we need. We just need to do it. So yes, thank you all for being here. There will be a follow-up email to all the attendees with presentations and info for how to get involved. And I see Katie is dropping lots of information and links in the chat. So Katie, I'll pass it over to you. And thank you so much to the panelists and Whose Streets Are Streets. Special shout out to legendary organizer Kale Shannon for bringing us together. And I hope everyone has a good night. Thanks.
Thank you so much for a wonderful panel, everybody. It was really inspiring, and you will have the letter which contains all the resources very soon. I put in the chat a couple of links, one to our remaining workshops, and one workshop that Rebecca mentioned specifically that's coming up, which includes showing the film Ramps to Nowhere for people to watch before the discussion about it at the workshop. We'd like to ask you please to fill out an evaluation for the workshop. That link is in the chat too. So thank you so much for coming, everybody. This concludes our presentation.